A very Merry Christmas for Darrell Jones.
Thank all of y'all for your work.
After 30 years behind bars, he's freed by one juror's guilty conscience.
Do you recall any jurors making any statements which may indicate racial bias?
Yes.
From the start, a questionable case.
They've got paid informants.
Doubts about the investigation and the trial.
No physical evidence and no eyewitness.
Ultimately, her regrets caused his release. Now, does his 30-year-old murder case start from square one? Case not closed, next on Chronicle. After spending more than 30 years behind bars for a murder he says he didn't commit, Darrell Jones walked out of Brockton Superior Court yesterday, freed on $5,000 bail.
Thank all of y'all for your work. Chronicle for believing in me, and that goes all the way down to Mary Richardson, who first came, and said, I believe you, I got you.
Jones is a lifer.
Mary Richardson first told Darrell's story in 2008. Over the years, other media organizations, including WBUR and the New England Center for Investigative Reporting, have reported on his struggle to get a new trial. Anthony Everett says it's a case that begins more than 3 decades ago, raising questions about police procedure, inadequate counsel, and possible racial bias on the part of a juror. Anthony Everett reports.
Darrell Jones' nightmare began on Veterans Day 1985, when he left his pregnant girlfriend and young son in Boston and took a train to Brockton to meet some friends at Pete and Mary's bar. Sometime around 10 p.m., Jones says, he left the bar to get a sub at D'Angelo's, just across the street. He then returned to the bar to eat his sub. Paul Jones and his girlfriend were in the D'Angelo's that night.
While I was in there was 2 people, a male and a female, African-American, attractive female. But I got my sandwiches and got in the car and we sat there, we were eating. This gentleman left. He went into that building over there. But I saw him come out. There was a taller man. They were arguing. And then this kid punched him in the stomach. And there was no shot, no sound. But there was a huge flash. And this guy went up in the air and fell. And I said, he just shot him.
The victim lay on the ground bleeding. The shooter took off.
And he ran right up that street. And I went right after him. And he ran right into that parking lot. And the cops showed up pretty quick.
Minutes later, police escorted Paul Jones and his girlfriend to Pete and Mary's to see if they could identify the shooter.
I was petrified, actually. I didn't recognize anybody. I saw no friends of mine, nothing. I knew absolutely nobody there. And I just wanted out of there, and I left.
They didn't just bring him to the bar. They stopped us at the door and said there was a shooting over across the street. Did anybody here see anybody run through here? That's what they was asking.
No question that he was there that night. He was in the bar. He was with several friends who testified on his behalf and, in fact, came out of the bar along with a number of other people and was displayed to Paul Jones and to Denise Perkins, both of whom did not select him from that group of people standing on the corner.
Guillermo Rodriguez was pronounced dead at a Brockton hospital. Darrell Jones maintains he did not know the victim.
Never met him. Never seen him. I don't know if I've seen him or not, because if he's in the bar, I don't know him. I have no reason to talk to him, right? So it's kind of like, who is he?
He was a 43-year-old Cuban native. He had been arrested for selling cocaine, and he was facing his own trial at the time he was killed.
Jennifer McKim knows Jones' case inside out. She spent a year examining it for the New England Center for Investigative Reporting and knows Jones was no angel. He had been arrested a few weeks before the shooting for stealing a wallet. He was fined $50. Yet, according to police notes, says McKim, it didn't take long for Brockton police to focus their investigation on Darrell Jones.
I knew most of the bad guys in the city, and this guy doesn't ring a bell with me at all.
Police relied on 2 informants who told them they had heard a rumor it was a guy named Diamond, a nickname Jones had acquired for his ability to charm the ladies. Bruce Gellerman investigated the story for WBUR Radio.
The first thing that we learned from the detectives is that they're using informants. That's what's important here. From the get-go, they've got paid informants, and they acknowledge it. And what happens is those informants, from day one, start fingering Darrell. He lives here, he lives in Boston, this is his age. Who are these people? Were they paid for their information? Well, that doesn't make them real trustworthy in my book. And we find out that, they don't want to talk to us. Surprise, surprise.
The informants said they didn't know Jones, but they heard he was an 18-year-old who carried a .38 and was wanted on outstanding arrest warrants in Boston. There were no warrants. Still, 6 days after the murder, Darrell Jones was arrested.
They didn't investigate anybody else. They had people with named suspects. Police had names. One guy was named Stephen Betts. He died a few years ago. They never tracked him down. They never spoke to him. They didn't do anything. This guy had a record pages and pages and pages long. They didn't go to him.
As I look at this case, I certainly think that there was significant tunnel vision and unwillingness to look at the evidence that didn't fit the picture of what they believed or they were, choosing to present as the truth. It's really impossible, at least for me, to look back and say, was this a deliberate setup? Or was he a convenient target? Or did they believe genuinely that he was involved and then became unable to recognize the many pieces of evidence that started to demonstrate why that was wrong?
No physical evidence and no eyewitness who went into court and actually said that's the guy who did it. And so it prompts a whole lot of questions, and then when you start delving into it and learning more about it, even becomes more and more the questions of how is it possible that this young man ended up in jail for life?
When Darrell Jones heard police suspected him of murder, he came back to Brockton to talk to them. But they found him first, here at Pete and Mary's bar. Jones says he wasn't worried. He had no reason to be.
I relied on knowing that I didn't do it. So I'm at the county jail, kicked back, thinking to myself, this is some and when I go out, man, I'm gonna be chilling.
Unable to pay the $49,000 bail, Jones spent 10 months waiting for his day in court. But when it came, it was hardly what he expected.
This guy came to see me one time.
The court-appointed lawyer was Brockton's Kenneth Elias.
And I only talked to this dude in the courtroom at all because I'm sitting way the hell back here and he's up there.
You read the transcripts and you are immediately struck by the very low level of preparation that this attorney engaged in, and by a number of other really aberrational things, like placing Mr. Jones in a dock 10 feet behind trial counsel's table.
The attorney actually said to the jury, don't take this any way or other. I don't like to sit next to the person I'm defending because they interrupt me and get in my way, and don't consider this prejudicial, but this is just the way I work.
Joining the Innocence program on the case, Neil Austin from the law firm Foley Hoag.
I think it's absolutely essential that the client be at the defense counsel table so that he or she has the ability to participate in his own defense.
To my mind, the optics of a client being in shackles 10 feet behind the lawyer conveys a message that this lawyer doesn't believe his client. He doesn't think that the client has anything worthwhile to offer in his own defense, and maybe he's even afraid of him.
Another questionable piece of information overlooked by Jones's lawyer. Several witnesses said the shooter was shorter than the victim.
I never even heard in the courtroom how tall the victim was. This is how you know I didn't know the victim. They never said how tall he was. They never said any of that. I just kept hearing the tall guy and the short guy, so I kept thinking this guy must be like 6'6" or something. You know what I mean? Like, he must be mad tall.
All of the eyewitnesses who described the perpetrator described this significant height differential when Mr. Jones and Mr. Rodriguez are essentially the same height.
What's more, witness after witness came to the stand. Not one positively identified Darrell Jones.
Not a single one identified Darrell as the shooter. So the only piece of evidence that the jury saw in which some witness pointed out a picture of Darrell was this videotape. And it was a videotape made of Terry Starks.
Relative to a shooting that took place.
What's interesting about Terry Lynn Starks is that she had a bunch of arrests for prostitution and drugs. She testifies, and all of a sudden, all of those arrests go away. It's quite stunning.
You know his name?
Add to that the videotape itself, the key that reopened this case, says McKim.
The Starks video is just crazy. This was the key testimony. You asked about how it was that he lost this case, and basically they believe it was because of what this interview with Terry Lynn Starks, where she was the only person that the jury heard who said this was the guy, because she picked up this photo of Darrell Jones, purportedly.
That one you picked out, was that the tall man or the man holding the gun?
The short man that was holding the gun.
And yet right in the middle of this very key interview, there comes in this crazy clip of a 50s television show, like a comedy in the middle of this, I mean, of course, very serious, important trial.
Who had the gun?
The small guy had the gun.
That man that's singing. Man, he was a blind.
Because of this interruption, made intentionally perhaps, lawyers say the video should never have been allowed into evidence. Their argument is bolstered by technology unavailable in 1986.
What we now have is new forensic analysis of the video, looking at it both in terms of the audio data and also the video data that quite definitively establishes it did not get altered in the way that the police described it being altered. Now, certainly, with the benefit of all of this new analysis, it's very clear that this video should not come into evidence, that it is inauthentic, and that it was the product of deliberate tampering.
And on the witness stand, when Starks looked at Jones, she could not positively identify him. A controversial videotape, a lack of positive IDs, no fingerprints. How and why was Jones convicted?
Evelyn Anderson, then a Boston public school reading specialist, says she was at Pete and Mary's bar and saw Jones eating his sub during the hours of the murder.
She spoke in the trial. What we understand also is the defense attorney, Darrell's attorney, really didn't interview anybody before this trial, which I understand from talking to some specialists in the field that's crazy, that you need to talk to people to know what they're going to say before you go to trial.
And worse, 3 days into the trial, Jones learned his lawyer had represented 3 of the police officers who were testifying against him.
I'm thinking, oh, I know what they're trying to do. They're trying to make me get off this lawyer so they can fix this lie the cop just told. We're gonna get him. They're gonna fix the lie the girl just told. That's all my mind is thinking. And then they're gonna try to make my parents and them pay for a lawyer. We ain't got no money for no lawyer. That's all I was thinking. So it didn't dawn on me. I'm thinking he's doing the job. He's telling me he's got this.
So when the judge asked Jones if he wanted another attorney, he said no.
Darrell didn't know about any of this before trial. Didn't know about it on day. He didn't learn about it until the 3rd day of trial, by which time one of those officers had already been cross-examined. So to me, that is a very serious problem. I think he should have been given the opportunity to talk to another lawyer.
A mistake Jones can easily see now, especially in light of the fact that his attorney lost his license to practice law a few months after his case.
It was known that he was disbarred for matters that did not relate directly to his representation of Mr. Jones. During the reinstatement process, we obtained records of that process, and he testified under oath at the hearing, explaining that his practice was completely out of control at this time, that he had no idea what was happening in his trial cases, and that the only thing he was paying any attention to was his cases in the SJC.
I said, how did you feel when you read that? And he just said, how do I feel? I'm sitting here in prison. I mean, I knew he didn't represent me well.
8 years later, Attorney Elias was reinstated to the bar.
He is deceased, and he was never examined under oath about the sort of breadth or context of his representation. So no judge ever heard from Mr. Elias on these critically important issues.
The 80s were a difficult time for Attorney Elias and for the Brockton Police Department as well.
At the time, Brockton was the Wild West. A lot of drugs, a tremendous change of population, and there was a lot of poverty and a lot of crime. And that was a bad combination.
Enough is...
Richard Spruill, then a Brockton police captain in charge of the department's detectives, says justice may not have been served in this case.
I wasn't that impressed with the case when I read it over. I've seen strong cases. That was my life. being a detective. What evidence is there that he did it?
Spruill says he knows what it feels like to be in prison. He pled guilty to stealing drugs seized as evidence by the department in the 1990s.
The chief of police, who had been the chief of detectives at the time, he acknowledges that I've been an addict for 5 years and I've been taking drugs out of the locker room. And he goes to the slammer for 27 months. But nobody else does.
What we have is records showing that there was a lot of cocaine that was taken out of the evidence locker by police and not returned. So there's a lot of questions about what was happening in that police department at the time.
But police maintain in Darrell Jones' case, they have the right man.
I talked to one of the investigators, Fotis Kalakoussis. He feels like the investigation was done correctly. He feels that Darrell Jones is rightfully in prison and isn't particularly a bad guy. That's his story.
Not so, says juror Eleanor Urbati, who had reservations about her guilty vote.
I just was not convinced that he did it.
For 30 years, guilt has eaten away at former juror Eleanor Urbati. She was never convinced Darrell Jones was guilty. She and others said as much when deliberation began. That's when jurors approached the judge.
And he says, go back until you do agree, which I thought was not nice. So little by little, everybody was turning to guilty. I felt pressured. And when they said life with no parole, I think I almost passed out in the chair in the courtroom. Oh, I was crying and everything. It was awful.
This past September, the state Supreme Judicial Court called in Eleanor Urbati and 3 other jurors to hear what they had to say. But 3 jurors, whom we are not permitted to show, could not remember details of the deliberations from 3 decades ago.
You don't recall any comments?
I don't remember any conversations amongst the jurors, of any content, to be honest. What we talked about, I really have no recollection.
But Eleanor Urbati clearly did.
Do you recall any jurors making any statements which may indicate racial bias?
Yes.
Okay. What do you recall the man saying?
I recall him saying that he was guilty. And I said, well, what makes you say that he's guilty? And I said, are you saying that because he's black? And he said, yes.
You have a memory of that.
In his final decision, Judge Thomas McGuire ruled that Jones's case was tainted by racial bias and police misconduct. He then vacated Jones's conviction. Yesterday, Jones's lawyers requested his release.
I urge this court to exercise its discretion to release Mr. Jones, to release him on his personal recognizance.
Prosecutors fought to keep Jones in prison, saying they have a strong case for appeal.
I would argue to the court that this is a conviction by 12 jurors on a murder case.
Superior Court Judge Robert Cosgrove did not agree.
I'm going to release him on the original bail of $5,000.
For Lisa Kavanaugh of the Innocence Program, the emotions of this moment mixed.
I'm at the same time overwhelmed by how much they've lost. To think about the fact that 32 years ago, as a 19-year-old, that Darrell Jones was taken into custody and that this is literally the first time he's walked out of court without shackles on his legs and hands is just devastating.
And Jones's case is not unique.
It's a reminder of how much wrong there is in our system. We have had 4 men exonerated in the span of 4 months, and each of them spent multiple decades in prison.
For the next year, Darrell Jones will live with the man he's called Dad for more than 10 years, Father William Barry.
But this man here brought me out of another kind of prison. He brought me out of prison that I was going through where I wouldn't even be here talking to you today, when I was at a real low point. You understand? And don't think everything looks good. I was at a point one day where I didn't want to be here. I didn't think I could make it through. He came, our first letter was, you know I'm black, right? Because I wrote him that. And he came and he's been with me. That's what a father does. So they call him Father Barry, he's my father.
And he says he will work to help those still locked up behind bars.
So I'm trying to get everybody here to understand one point. There's somebody else back at that jail that nobody's listening to, that's probably innocent and been trying to fight like I've been trying to fight. And I'm just asking all the reporters and people that do this to sometimes give them a chance.